99 degrees.
Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone, and this is another Dump the Corruption show. And what I want to talk about tonight is the reason why we need the Dump the Corruption movement. And I also want to talk about actually the effects of the oligarchy in the context of RFKJ Jr.'s campaign and also the role, of AIPAC. But let's get to the question, of oligarchy. And for that purpose, I want to bring up a post from Tom Hartman, who's written and spoken a lot about the problem of oligarchy here in America, and wrote a recent book on it. I've done a good bit of writing on oligarchy myself, but I haven't done a book specifically on that particular problem as yet, but the subject is very close to my heart. So there is that. Excuse me a moment while I share this one on Facebook. Okay, that's done. Oh, I don't see Kay here yet. She's a big Tom Hartman fan, so I was kind of hoping she might be there for this. Okay. Anyway, so here is a recent post on the subject of oligarchy from Tom Hartman. It's in Common Dreams. The American oligarchs have arrived to destroy by U.S. democracy. And taglines are: oligarchy is corrosive, it destroys trust and confidence in government, it breeds cynicism and discontent. If not challenged, it will swallow us whole. And Tom Hartman published this in Common Dreams on October 30th, 2023. And I'm going to read and comment on the whole thing. Many of America's oligarchs, the people whose great wealth and or ownership of media properties gives them tremendous influence over our politics, believe they're arguing for policies that will produce a better, quote unquote, America, or at least an America that's better and safer for oligarchs and their families and businesses. Tragically, they're wrong. Their support for GOP-aligned, racist, quote, free market deregulation, unquote, climate denial policies are tearing America apart and will threaten their grandchildren every bit as much as they do yours, and mine. I think that's a very insightful comment, from Tom, and I entirely agree with it free market deregulation leads only to more oligarchy, to more class conflict, and eventually to totalitarian systems of various kinds, most often to right-wing totalitarian systems. But they can lead to left-wing totalitarian systems also. Anyway, they lead to much violence and much suffering going on. Nonetheless, in America and increasingly around the world, oligarchs taking over the political dialogues of nations are all the rage. From America to Turkey to Russia to the Philippines, oligarchs have either risen to near absolute power or bought off so many politicians that they have effective control of entire political parties and thus, entire nations. There can be some arguments, on this point. There is certainly argument about whether there's as much oligarchy in Russia today as there is, in the United States today. There's argument about the extent to which, let's say, Putin, is a dictator. In Russia, he's frequently thought of that way, and he's frequently called that. But we've seen him in recent years doing an awful lot of consultation with people and ruling in a very collective way, not at all similar to Joseph Stalin, for example, but very different. And of course, that's also true in China. Now, of course, the Communist Party has control over China, but the Communist Party has also distributed itself throughout China so that the problem-solving structure of things in China is quite distributive. In many ways, it's bottom-up. There's a lot of consultation that goes on there in their system. They don't have the kind of democracy that we believe we have here, but they do have a certain kind of democracy there, and we need to respect the achievements and to recognize that the oligarchs don't have but near absolute power there and do not rule in that way. But going on, increasingly, America's oligarch problem has become the world's oligarchy problem. As country after country follows the GOP's example and sidelines labor's rights, women's rights, voting rights, and democracy itself, I think Tom has a bias towards the Democratic Party, which is unwarranted. I agree with him about what the GOP has been doing. And I certainly recognize the rhetoric of the Democrats in supporting labor's rights and women's rights, and voting rights and democracy itself. But when it comes to actions, certainly the Biden administration has not been completely pro-labor. It has been pro-labor, in rhetoric. It has been pro-labor in certain respects, specifically appointments of the Secretary of Labor. But, of course, it also snuffed out the rights of labor, in the recent strike, of railroads, and basically undermined the position of labor in that particular strike. As far, as women's rights, it's been pretty impotent in protecting the rights of women. It also never prioritized protection of voting rights. When Biden came in, he basically allowed some of the oligarchs inside the Democratic Party to sideline moves to protect the voting rights of Hispanics and blacks, in the United States. And the resistance, to the GOP's attempts at voter suppression, and gerrymandering has been pitiful on the part of the Democrats. It can only be described as weak, and pitiful. When the Constitution was being written, there were multiple debates about how to prevent our republic from turning into a dictatorship, or an oligarchy. Thomas Jefferson was worried about too much power being invested in the president. John Adams was concerned that wealthy oligarchs would either get themselves elected to the Senate or simply purchase senators for their own ends. And of course, we're seeing that happen in spades in the last 2 decades, aren't we? While Jefferson was still the U.S. envoy to France and living in Paris just after the Constitution had been written, but a year before, it would be ratified. I think Tom has his dates confused here. While Jefferson was still the U.S. envoy to France and living in Paris just after the Constitution has been written, I think what he's talking about here is 1788, not 1778. He says Adams wrote him on December 6th, 1778. No, that was 1788, because that's when the Constitution was written, and before it was ratified. It was ratified in 1789. Anyway, a quote from Adams: "You are afraid of the one, and I of the few. We agree perfectly that the many should have a full, fair, and a perfect representation. You are apprehensive of monarchy, I, of aristocracy." And Tom says, today we have both. Donald Trump was both an oligarch and very much wanted and tried to become America's first Caesar, an emperor with unlimited power who would hold his office for life. And by the way, if he's elected again, he's going to make that kind of move again. You can be sure of that, folks. You can be absolutely sure. I was asked by someone to try to distinguish my quotation of the articles from my commentary on the articles. So I'm doing so here. The comment that he will try it again, that's my commentary on that particular statement. At the same time, going back to the article, because of the corrupt Citizens United decision by 5 Republicans on the court, both the Senate, House, and much of America's media are very much under the control of our nation's right-wing, very much under control of the oligarchs, our nation's right-wing oligarchs. I have to say, I think the left-wing oligarchs, well, there aren't really too many of the left-wing oligarchs in the popular press. George Soros is often considered to be a left-wing oligarch, but people who are really left-wing don't consider Soros to be very left-wing at all. I don't know if there is a left-wing oligarch, at this point. The most left-wing of the oligarchs might be somebody like, say, Nick Hanauer or Tom Steyer, and I'm making, again, commentary, but neither of them are very left-wing. Indeed, it's a phenomenon that's popping up worldwide. In a new book, The Oligarch's Grip, authors David Lingelbach and Valentina Rodriguez Guerra take the definition of oligarch, quote unquote, beyond the common understanding, the person who, is morbidly rich. Well, that was never my understanding, of oligarch, but anyway. In a review of the book for the Financial Times, Simon Cooper writes, quote, the book distinguishes various types of oligarchs. Business oligarchs like Musk turn wealth into political power, while, quote, political oligarchs, quote unquote, go the other way. A classic example of the latter, says the book, is Vladimir Putin, quote, a billionaire, with nuclear weapons. Well, he was not a billionaire at first. He became a billionaire during the course of his rule, which shows him as an example, of a political oligarch who was going the other way. At the time when he first took over, it might be argued that in the first few years that he was an oligarch then. I think he's becoming less and less of an oligarch, perhaps as time goes on. At least I'm perceiving it, in that way. But anyway, continuing on with the article. Oligarch presidents have decision-making power. Oligarch influences such as Rupert Murdoch, Charles Koch, and George Soros set agendas, while platform owners such as Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and Google's Larry Page have rewired the information streams that flow into our brains. I think that's a pretty interesting statement there in that paragraph. Pretty good statement. The authors of The Oligarch's Grip argue that a true oligarch is a rich person who uses his or her, it's almost always a man though, money to seize political power, whether by running for office or simply buying and owning politicians or an elected or appointed official who use their political position and power to make a boatload of money. I think Nancy Pelosi and her husband did that, of course. That was my comment. A true oligarch, they write, is, quote, someone who secures and reproduces wealth or power, then transforms one into the other. Yes, by the way, I should mention Harold Palasswell. He was a modern political theorist. He began writing in the 1930s. He was at the University of Chicago. At the time, he later went to Yale. And over the years, he wrote about influence, and power. And he talked about also the phenomenon of, he used the framework, of values that people had, influence, and power, and knowledge, and wealth. And he wrote about the phenomenon, of agglutination of the values, that when someone would usually have a base in one of the values and then would use that base to increase their position in relation of some of the other values. So anyway, he was very aware of this process of someone, for example, who was known for their knowledge, becoming wealthy, and then perhaps, having political influence way out of proportion to what they had at the start of the process of the agglutination, of values. And of course, the phenomenon of someone who was wealthy, attaining political power, was well known even when he was writing in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. He had a very long career, and he was very influential through all this time. He was among probably the top 5 of the political scientists in the country through all this period of time. This is a comment by me, a little context or background. For example, when South America was working out their post-apartheid constitution, one of America's largest corporations loaned them a lawyer who helped get corporate personhood written into their constitution, along with fighting most efforts at limiting money in South African politics. This is a great example by Tom Hartman going on. The result was predictable. Current South African President Cyril Ramaphosa rose from a union leader through the political ranks to becoming, in 1994, the chairman of the Constitutional Assembly, which wrote the new Constitution for South Africa. Knowing the rules of the game he'd helped write, he retired from politics in 1996 to seek his fortune using his considerable political connections and power, ended up in short order as one of South Africa's dozen or so billionaire oligarchs. Once he became fabulously rich through his political connections, he got himself elected president in 2018 and was recently reelected. And if you remember, just a few months ago, he was chairperson of the BRICS conference, the conference at which they invited 6 more nations to join the BRICS. And Cyril Ramaphosa was at the center of that particular conference. It was never mentioned in the coverage of the conference or the BRICS that he was a politician, that he was a union leader who became a politician and who then helped to write the politicians whose rules he used to make a considerable political fortune, and that he had ended up as the president and for a little while anyway at the center of the BRICS world. Okay, so this is all very interesting as a study in value agglutination is the term that Lasswell used. Here in the USA, we've seen this cycle play out more than once. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the American oligarchs had largely avoided politics until World War I. Well, I don't know that I don't think that's true. But J.P. Morgan had a tremendous influence on politics, in the early days of the 20th century. Indeed, it is quite clear that he saved the United States from economic default in the years 1907, 1908 by using his personal fortune to do so. And then he was instrumental, of course, in the founding of the Federal Reserve, as well, in 1913. But going on, the American oligarchs had largely avoided politics till World War I. I guess I got to comment some more about that. What the oligarchs did during the 19th century was to block attempts at reform all through the period after the Civil War in the last third of the 19th century. They did this and prevented any constraints on the growth of the power, of the oligarchs, themselves, and they were quite successful at that. They prevented a consolidation of power, in the central government and deliberately divided the people across the states, because state by state, they were able to dominate politics and to shape it to their advantage at the local level and at the state level. and they prevented the rise of issues, to the national level, until the presidency, of Theodore Roosevelt. And then they still had a great influence on Roosevelt and Taft and Woodrow Wilson as well. So I don't think they avoided politics. It was just exerted, at a different level. But following the war and Woodrow Wilson's raising the top tax rate to 91%, many jumped in with both feet when Warren Harding ran for president on the Republican ticket in 1920. By the way, of course, the Roosevelts, who certainly were very rich and influential people, both Teddy and Franklin, went into politics for Teddy in the last days of the 19th century, and then was extremely prominent through the early days of the 20th century. And Franklin Roosevelt also entered politics in the early days of the 20th century and rose to Secretary of the Navy in the First World War. So he was already very prominent. And of course, the Roosevelts were economic oligarchs back then. So many jumped in with both feet, and Warren Harding ran for president on the Republican ticket in 1920. Harding's platform was twofold: quote, a return to normalcy, which meant lowering the top wartime income tax bracket on the morbidly rich from 91% down to 25%. And by the way, not many people know that in Woodrow Wilson's time that the top income tax rate rose to 91%. That's greater than at any other time in the history of the Republic, except I think in 1 year of the Roosevelt administration, it rose to 94% during the Second World War. And, quote, more business in government, less government in business, privatize and deregulate. Not that there was that much regulation before the 1920s, in my view, but it had started. And of course, the battle with the private sector people trying to eliminate it came to full flower during the 1920s. The uber wealthy, going on with the article, and owners of America's largest newspapers loved it. They threw a small fortune into getting Harding elected, and he won the popular vote by 26.2%, the largest margin in American history. Of course, he was known to be among the worst presidents in American history, but that's a little unfair because he was not the president for a very long time. I forget how long he was the president. It was either 1 or 3 years, I forget. But his vice president was Calvin Coolidge, who served out the rest of his term and was elected himself in 2024. For the next 9 years, Republicans went on a tax cutting and regulation, destroying spree known as the Roaring Twenties, making the merely rich into the morbidly rich while keeping average working people in poverty by violently fighting that era's union movement, routinely murdering strikers and union leaders. Their excesses led straight to the stock market crash of October 1929, which kicked off the Republican Great Depression and brought Democratic President Franklin D. Roosevelt into office. Roosevelt gleefully took on America's most toxic oligarchs, saying, quote, they hate me and I welcome their hatred. In this connection, I'd be remiss not to mention the presidency of Herbert Hoover from 1929 to 1933. Hoover was a Republican progressive, actually, and even though he's remembered today as an ineffectual president, in the face of the Depression because he was hamstrung by certain beliefs, in a balanced budget and certain other beliefs. Uh, he did do things that were normally associated with the progressive administration, like, for example, raising the income tax rate up there high again. Uh, I believe when he left, it was close to the 90% level. And he also did certain things that Roosevelt was able to use to make the New Deal, a real force. So he did a number of really progressive things when he was president, but overall his efforts, were ineffectual. And so Roosevelt was able to win in 1932 and to introduce, the New Deal. But it wasn't because Herbert Hoover always favored the capitalists. And in other words, he wasn't the Calvin Coolidge, and he wasn't the Warren G. Harding. Uh, he was different. He was relatively honest. But also, it has to be mentioned that he was an oligarch himself. He became an extremely rich man. He did not start out in that way, but he became an extremely rich man. And that was one of the reasons why he was elected, to political office in 1928. It was the height of the prosperity then, and people wanted someone, they thought that someone who was a good businessman would certainly be, a good president. And I have to say, they could have done worse than Herbert Hoover. For example, they could have gotten another president like Calvin Coolidge. That would have been much, much worse. Anyway, going on with the article, between that and the failed attempt of the DuPont family and a handful of other oligarchs allegedly organized to kidnap and kill FDR, ended by General Smedley Butler, the oligarchs in America decided to pretty much stay out of politics after World War II. Well, I mean, again, there are exceptions to this. They did retreat after World War II, somewhat. But then there's Eisenhower's Secretary Secretary of Defense, that is to say, the engine Charlie Wilson, a very, very rich man, from General Motors, who was famous for saying, "So goes General Motors, but so goes America." And he was not exactly a friend, to labor, and he was not a friend of higher taxes either, though, to his credit, Eisenhower, as president, kept higher taxes in place, and it was left to John F. Kennedy to be the first one to lower income tax rates to less than 90%. That 90% rate obtained through the whole of the Eisenhower presidency. But the oligarchs were weaker during those years, no doubt about it. The Nixon and Agnew bribery scandals of the late 1960s and early 1970s produced a whole new crop of laws further limiting America's oligarchs from participating in politics. The top tax rate was generally around 90%, giving the very wealthy an incentive to leave their money in their businesses and pay their employees well. Remember, the Kennedy-Johnson tax cuts cut the tax rates to 70%. I say the Kennedy-Johnson because the plan for doing the tax cuts was started, under Kennedy, but it was Johnson. Well, Kennedy got the original tax cut, but it was Johnson's who maintained the tax rates at the 70% level. Anyway, so the top tax rate uh, in the 1960s and early 1970s wasn't at 90% anymore. That seems to be the implication of Tom Hartman's paragraph here. But giving the very wealthy an incentive to leave their money in their businesses and pay their employees well. I agree. That was a key factor. In other words, if you take the profits out of your business, you're going to get taxed at 90%. It does give you an incentive to leave the money in the businesses, maybe pay the employees better, but also do other things to expand the businesses and make them grow, because that's better than having your money taxed away by the federal government. Which is why from the 1930s to the end of the 1970s, the American middle class grew in both numbers and wealth faster than any the world had ever seen. And that is true. But right now, it may be the case that the Chinese middle class is growing in both numbers and wealth faster than any the world has ever seen. Just had to add that because I think it's true, and it's an interesting perspective on this. Going back to the article. But then in the 1970s, 5 Republicans on the Supreme Court, for the first time in American history, began the process of legalizing political bribery, first ruling that laws limiting big money in politics were suppressing the, quote, free speech rights of billionaires. That was in 1976. And I believe that decision was written by Lewis Powell, and then extending that right to bribe corporations as well. That was in 1978. I forget the names of the new cases at this point, but they're very famous. And they were the precursors to the Citizens United case in 2010. They developed the legal justifications that we used in the 2010 case that has been such a boon to the oligarchs since that time. In buying politicians, of course. This was a huge flag for America's oligarchs, signaling that, like during Harding's, Coolidge's, and Hoover's time, the GOP was again up for sale to the highest bidder. Those with money began shoveling it at politicians who do their bidding, and politicians with power began to get seriously rich from their association with the oligarchs. Nancy Pelosi, a beautiful case in point. Bill Clinton, a beautiful case in point, though most of his accretion of wealth came after he was president, but he still had, a lot of influence, of course, and he used that influence to get seriously rich in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And of course, that model was followed by Obama, who cultivated connections with the oligarchs while he was in office, specifically with Peter G. Peterson, who, by the way, was very tight with Bill Clinton during the 1990s, and with others from the 1970s on, and who kept going from private business into government and back again, and the rotation from the public sector to the private sector, and who became a 5 billionaire, as a result of those kinds of operations, over a period of time. Anyway, history knows that time as the, quote, Reagan Revolution. In 2010, 5 Republicans on the Supreme Court doubled down on their predecessors' work, making it super easy for billionaires to give lavish gifts and support to Supreme Court justices and members of Congress. That Citizens United decision blew open the doors to oligarchy in America. A new report from Americans for Tax Fairness details the damage these democracy-destroying decisions made by SCOTUS members, who themselves were at the time being groomed by billionaires, have done to our political system. Yes, as we now know, okay, the corruption surrounding Supreme Court members has been very substantial. In 2010, okay, American billionaires spent a mere 31 million, okay, on elections. The Buckley and Bellotti cases notwithstanding, there were still substantial limits on dark money and big money in politics. But that was the year the court handed down their Citizens United decision. That number jumped to 231 million in the 2012-2014 elections and over 600 million for both 2016 and 2018. The big blowout came in 2020 when Trump was running for re-election. There was a very real chance the billionaires could seize complete control of the federal government. They spent a total of $2,362,000 in that election, with $1.2 billion of it going to elect conventional politicians who would then be beholden to their patrons. As Americans for Tax Fairness noted, quote, the report finds that almost 40% of all billionaire campaign contributions made since 1990 occurred during the 2020 season. You can imagine, by the way, what's going to happen in 2024. 2022 was a very big year for them, also spending. 2024 is going to break all records. I'm interjecting that here. Going on with the quote, billionaires had a lot more money to give politicians and political causes in 2020 as their collective wealth jumped by nearly a third, or over 900 billion to 3.9 trillion between the March beginning of the pandemic and a month before Election Day. Billionaire fortunes have continued to climb since. As of October 2021, billionaires were worth on the average $5.1 trillion, more than a 20-fold increase in their collective fortune since 1990, when it stood at $240 billion. This is adjusted for inflation. Quote, these campaign donations are a profitable investment. They buy access to politicians and influence over tax and other policies that can save tycoons billions of dollars. While that $1.2 billion investment in 2020 was massive, it totaled less than 0.1% of billionaire wealth and less than 1 day's worth of their pandemic wealth growth, leaving almost unlimited room for future growth in billionaire campaign spending, unquote. And next year will be far worse, as NBC News tells us. Quote, political ad spending is projected to reach new heights by the end of the 2024 election cycle, eclipsing $10 billion in what would amount to the most expensive 2 years in political history. This crisis of oligarchy isn't limited to the United States. The Thatcher-Reagan, quote, great neoliberal experiment, unquote, of the late 1970s and 1980s, which included deregulation of campaign contributions and gutting political bribery laws, was experienced worldwide. For 30 years, ending laws against political bribery became an international fad. Oligarchs promoted it at Davos and before the UN. Countries around the world tried to imitate America's tax cut policy. As a result, since 1980, we have seen multiple democracies first flip into oligarchy. Many then went all the way to full-on fascism. They include Russia, I guess I'd argue about that, Turkey, I might argue a little about that too, the Philippines, Peru, Brazil in recovery now, El Salvador, Czech Republic, Georgia, Hungary, North Macedonia, Poland, Romania, Serbia, Nigeria, Nepal, and Montenegro. Each of these countries are now controlled by local oligarchs. So why are these oligarchs putting all this time and money into deconstructing democracy in nation after nation? Numerous studies in history tell us that great wealth distorts the mind. As wealth goes up, empathy goes down. People who've achieved great wealth, even when inherited, like with Trump or Charles Koch, often become Charles Koch, often come to believe that their success is purely a function of their own brilliance. Yes, certainly Elon Musk believes that, and probably Bill Gates too, and and their superb judgment. Well, certainly Larry Ellison believes that, and their superb judgment should give them the right to decide what. Okay, and Jeff Bezos, what's best for the nation and the world, whether it's Elon Musk retweeting white supremacists, Mark Zuckerberg dialing back on the moderation of content, Rupert Murdoch platforming lies and disinformation, or Charles Koch funding think tanks and political action groups across the nation. You could say that about George Soros too. All of them believe they're doing the right thing. But in any population, including a population of oligarchs, there will always be people who are so damaged, uninformed, or narcissistic that they're destructive to everything and everyone around them. The difference is that ordinary people, unless they buy an AR-15, are incapable of destroying many people's lives, whereas oligarchs routinely make decisions that often lead to just that outcome. Oligarchy, as I lay out in the hidden history of American oligarchy, is neither a stable political nor economic system. It's always a transitional system, typically a mere way station in the shift from democracy to fascism or some other form of authoritarianism, and it tears nations apart. The United States is suffering from a crisis of cynicism about our political system. Few trust our politicians or political parties. The reason, apparently invisible to the media, is simple. Everybody can see that what the vast majority of Americans want: stronger social safety net, climate action, better schools, affordable health care, universal health care we want, and we want health care free at the point of service, Tom. And we don't want the Affordable Care Act, Tom. A nation free of gun violence, the rich paying their taxes, isn't happening. And in every case, Americans know these things are not happening because some oligarch is paying off some politician. Oligarchy is corrosive. It destroys trust and confidence in government. It breeds cynicism and discontent. It encourages crime, both white-collar crime and on the street. It even corrupts the nation's legal system, as we can see with the Trump trials. If he wasn't a billionaire oligarch, he would have been in prison long ago. The world is slowly coming to terms with its crisis of oligarchy. Before Barack Obama showed how Democratic politicians could fund elections without oligarchs' money, he might have showed that, but he took the oligarchs' money. Their money, the money of the large donations people in the Obama campaign, was greater than his small dollar donations. He did show that elections could be funded with small dollar donations, but he himself funded his election with both the small dollar donations and the extremely large donations and the PAC money and the super PAC money. I mean, the possible implication here that Obama was only about small dollar donations, Tom, that's ridiculous. Even the Democratic Party, starting with the 1992 election, had slipped into neoliberalism and begun to dance to the oligarchs' tune. That is true. Absolutely true. That was the election of Bill Clinton, who got some oligarch money. Now, the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which eschews PAC and other dark money, is nearly half the party at the federal level, and President Biden is leading a charge for campaign finance reform. Well, that's an exaggeration. This is another comment of mine. The CPC has about 100 people, but there are at least 20 to 25 of them who who are progressives in name only. Until recently, Catherine Clark was in the CPC. Hakeem Jeffries was in the CPC. Before Nancy Pelosi took over as a speaker, she was in the CPC. There are many CPC members who are not actually progressive by any reasonable definition of that term. If there are 75 out of the 100 or so who aren't progressive, that's a generous estimate. I personally think there may be only 40. So they are far from half of the party at the federal level. The party at the federal level right now in Congress, at least in the House, it's 212, the representatives, close to, but not a majority, far more than the 40 or so real progressives, you might say. And there's even a question about whether they are real progressives. One might make a reasonable claim progressives in the House, but it's nothing like that 100. Anyway, it's nearly half the party at the federal level, and President Biden is leading a charge for campaign finance reform. You're kidding. What kind of charge is he leading for campaign finance reform? I mean, Tom, it's news to me. It nearly brought fruit last year when only at the last minute did bought-off Senators Sinema and Manchin join a Republican filibuster to kill the For the People bill that would have begun the process of again limiting dark money in politics. Well, the For the People bill wouldn't have done very much. I mean, here's Tom saying it would have begun the process. It would have begun a very slow process. Now, Tom, we cannot have a very slow process. We need a process that's quick enough that the oligarchs no longer dominate American politics in the election of 2024 so that we can get started on doing something substantive about the climate emergency. I mean, we are literally dying here. I mean, the For the People bill is a piece of crap compared to what we need. As long as Republicans, deeply corrupted by America's right-wing billionaires, control the House of Representatives, there's little we can do about our oligarchy crisis at the federal level. Well, who controlled the House of Representatives for 4 years before the Republicans took over? And what did they do about our oligarchy crisis at the federal level? Almost nothing. I mean, the Democrats did almost nothing. Last time they had really, really substantial power, back in 2009, they did almost nothing to limit the power of the oligarchs. In fact, the Obama administration and the Congress, with 245 members of the House, with that kind of majority, the Democrats did almost nothing to limit the powers of the oligarchs. In fact, Obama protected the oligarchs from the pitchforks. He said that. He said as much. Democrats are not the answer. Anyway, but lots is happening at the state level and movement building to overturn Citizens United and its unprincipled predecessors well underway. If we have to wait for that movement building to overturn CO, we're talking about somewhere in the mid-2030s, and it will be far too late to stem the tide of the climate crisis. We will all be facing the heat death. If you agree, hook up with your local Democratic party and let them and your elected officials know your top priority is to end oligarchy, return American government to the people who vote to elect our officials instead of the billionaires who pay for their TV ads. Step by step, we'll make America into a functioning democracy. This time, it'll be a fully uh, uh, inclusive one. Uh, Tom puts the correction here. An early version of this column misidentified the first name of Simon Cooper, the author of the book review in the Financial Times. This has been fixed. Yes, it has. In many ways, this was a great column, but Tom really blew it, okay, at the end, revealing his continuous bias over the years towards the Democratic Party. Both of the major parties have to be broken by the people because they both reflect the oligarchy, and they're not changing quickly enough to make a difference. That is the reason for the dump the corruption movement. That is why it is so important, because if everyone, all the voters, were to take up the dump the corruption movement and follow the rule we have put forward for voting, the House would be changed in a single election. No one who took big money would be returned to the House. There would be only new people, and they wouldn't be members of the Republican and Democratic Party, because there was no one in the Republican and Democratic Party who was running without taking big money. We've established that in this Stump the Corruption series. We need to move a lot faster than Tom Hartman, is envisioning. We need to move at least 10, maybe 15 years faster than he is envisioning. His way is not going to work. Dump the corruption will work. At this point, I usually show my rule, so I am going to do that again very briefly, though, because I still have two pieces here that I want to go through. But let me just do that. Hey, Sandy Degg. Hi, wonderful to see you here. And Steve Wolfbrand and Kay. I was covering one of your favorites tonight, Kay, Tom Hartman, of course. Let me share the screen for the rule. Here again is the rule. The dump the corruption movement crystallized into one rule. The rule: vote against every candidate except those who won't take money from wealthy corporations, individuals, wealthy individuals, that is, PACs or party committees, and who repudiate all super PAC support. So I've said that again and again and again here. If everybody followed that rule, not one of the current House members would be returned to office. A clean sweep of both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, with new people coming in who are not members of either party, because no one in either party is running on the basis of small dollar donations alone. We can see that already as the election is shaping up. What the hell did I do here? I didn't actually do anything except get rid of my rule. That's good. Sure. Okay, Bonnie wants to use the microwave for a minute, so I told her that was fine. I'm going to move on to the next piece. That piece is a statement, by AOC. We can make short work of it. It is from Common Dreams. And here is AOC speaking during the July 26, 2023 House Oversight Committee hearing on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. And as AIPAC boosts Israel military aid package, AOC says group is no friend to American democracy. So AIPAC is a great example of the power of oligarchy here in the United States. Its funding comes from billionaires. It is a threat to progressive candidates. Continuously, it throws millions of dollars, into elections to try to oppose and knock off those candidates and keep American politics grounded in the right wing. It supports Republicans to a great extent. It's against, progressive Democrats, in an extreme way. She says it's past time for us to recognize how toxic of a presence AIPAC has been in our political system. Of course, she's dead right. This article is by Julia Connolly. It was from today's Common Dreams. She dismissed the latest political attack by AIPAC, the powerful anti-Palestinian rights lobbying group, by a lawmaker who rejected legislation. That's endorsed by the program. She responded to a social media post, by AIPAC. The group criticized Representative Thomas Massey, Republican of Kentucky, for being the only Republican who voted against House Resolution 771, which stated that the U.S., quote, stands with Israel as it defends itself. Then AIPAC denounced Massey on Tuesday for announcing he would vote against a separate resolution scheduled to be taken up by the House Rules Committee on Wednesday to send more than $14 billion in aid, including military funding, to Israel. AIPAC said in support of the proposal that U.S. is stronger when Israel is secure. But AIPAC billionaire money and the money of very rich people flows into AIPAC, which then funds these Republicans and Democrats who lockstep, support Israel all the time. It's a clear case, of bribery. It's a clear case of using money to terrorize people who are more progressive when it comes to Palestinian rights. Quote, AIPAC endorsed scores of January 6th insurrectionists. This is a quote. They're no friend to American democracy, unquote. Ocasio-Cortez responded to the group's comments on Thomas Massey. She calls them, an extremist organization, and she's right. And of course, what they're about is trying to get out of Congress the only person of Palestinian origin there, specifically Rashida Tlaib, who's, by the way, for her district, a very, very good congressman, represents them, extremely well. And they don't like her because she's for Palestinian rights. She's not for Palestinians slaughtering Israelis or anything like that. She's just for the recognition of the human rights of the Palestinians, and for that, she must go. And AIPAC throws in its money against all the people here who have voted against, the resolution. Thomas Massey, Jamal Bowman, Cori Bush, Summer Lee, well, not all of them, Summer Lee, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, also Delia Ramirez and Rashida Tlaib, all were opposed by AIPAC money in 2022. I'm not sure about whether Bowman was or not, because he had been playing some footsie with Israeli interests, in his district. Some of the people who abstained on it, for example, Greg Casar, Chewy Garcia, also Pramila Jayapal, but especially Casar, they have to worry about AIPAC money throwing into their district, against them, just for abstaining on this vote, I'm sure. Okay, so that's a case of oligarchs intervening and having a very heavy influence, okay, on American politics. And we all know they are also responsible for the defeat, okay, of Nina Turner, okay, in Ohio, and the election of Chantel Brown twice. Okay, moving on now to the final piece that I wanted to talk about here tonight. And this is, I think, a particularly egregious situation, I must say. This last is an article by Scott Ritter, who I've used here before. What am I sharing? I don't think that is what, okay, I meant to share. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm sharing the wrong thing here. And let me pull up the right thing. Oh, I'm sorry. I did have the right thing up. I just shared something else that I had up about Scott Ritter, but I will pull in the right thing now. That was my error. Okay, this is from Scott Ritter's Substack, and it's Bobby Kennedy, Israel, and the Hypocrisy of Peace and Diplomacy. It's a very long article. I'm not going to read it. I'm going to go through it fast. But this is his experience, okay, with Bobby Kennedy, who he calls a man of vision, a nonconformist who dared challenge the conventional thinking on a wide range of issues, incurring the wrath of the establishment, okay, in the process. And he talks about his early entry into the race, okay, and his views, his nonconformist views. Scott also talks about his spending some quality time with someone he's known for years, specifically Dennis Bakusinich, who became the campaign manager for Bobby Kennedy for months. Anyway, Scott says Dennis was excited about the prospects of a Kennedy run. And that night, when he talked to Scott, before he became the campaign manager, we outlined what we believe to be the list of positives that accrued to a Bobby Kennedy candidacy. The list was long, says Scott, and although fueled by beer and pretzels, it was rational. Bobby was the anti-candidate, the perfect antidote to the ignorant arrogance of Donald Trump and the incompetent ignorance of the incumbent Joe Biden. If Bobby could find the sweet spot between the two candidates, Dennis and I strategized, then he had a very good shot at taking home the grand prize. Scott says he struggled with Bobby's candidacy early on over his stance on the Russia-Ukraine conflict and Russia in general. His position seemed to be influenced by the experience of his son, Connor. But to make that long story short, Bobby came out with the position, which in the end was a good one. It was a position for negotiations. Okay, it was a position for peace. Okay, it was a position that Scott was able to get behind. And in the early days when Bobby was running, Scott was very, very optimistic about him. And of course, his association with the efforts of John F. Kennedy to bring about a situation of peace, and disarmament. And as many of you know, Scott has been very instrumental in the whole movement for disarmament But since the 1980s, he was a central figure in getting the disarmament agreements of the 1980s when he worked as an inspector. Okay, he worked as in terms of helping with the negotiations. Then he worked as a UN inspector to make sure that the agreements that negotiated during the 1980s but actually worked. Scott has been a worker for peace, even though he's a warrior for himself. He's been a worker for peace for many, many years. I don't want to go through this, so I'm skipping ahead. Bobby was positioning himself to be the only candidate with a track record of getting it right on the issue of Ukraine, and as such, being in a position to conceive and implement policies that had a chance of helping craft a long-term solution to the overall issue of European security. Yeah, he was positioning himself in that way for some time. Scott says, these words were music to my ears. I just returned from a 26-day, 12-city tour of Russia promoting my book, Disarmament in the Time, of Perestroika, which had been published in the Russian language by Komsomolskaya Pravda, one of the oldest and most respected publishing houses in Russia. The visit was far more than simply a book marketing ploy. It was a personal journey of discovery where I sought not only to put myself in the shoes of the Russian people, but peer inside their collective soul in an effort to better understand their perspective on life. JFK's American University speech was a motivating factor in my journey, as it said in Russian events pertaining to arms control that ended up being manifested in the 1997 Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which I helped implement as a weapons inspector, and the experiences of which form the basis of my book. Anyway, Bobby channeled his uncle in the words of his peace and diplomacy speech, saying of the Russians that, quote, they have legitimate security concerns the same as we do, and we to understand that. He, JFK, reminded Americans of the suffering that the Russians had endured during the Second World War, unimaginable suffering. By the way, they also endured unimaginable suffering in the First World War as well, which led to the revolution in Russia. Not many people remember that. That needs to be remembered. But 1 in 7 Russians had been killed during World War II. Bobby Kennedy asked Americans to imagine, JFK asked Americans to imagine all the land, all the cities, all the towns from the East Coast of Chicago had been leveled to rubble, that the forests and fields had been burned. And he said, that's what happened to Russia during the war. That's what they sacrificed for us. And they have there are security concerns, that are legitimate, to make sure that never happens again. That speech turned around the American people, and they ended up supporting the treaty. It was one of the fastest ratified treaties, in American history. After that speech, there was never a doubt I was on team Bobby, says Scott. He liked Bobby's candor, but there were some things about him that made me feel uncomfortable. I'd taken the time to read up on Bobby before I did an interview with him on April 9th on the cost of war. I found one article he authored for Politico back in 2016, Why the Arabs Don't Want Us in Syria, particularly illuminating. And there was a quote, in that article. And Scott really liked that quote. He said these words, were music to my ears. There was, however, one note that sounded off key. Tucked away near the end of his lengthy piece was a single reference to Israel. I was struck by the fact that Israel wasn't factoring more in his narrative. He said, quote, we need, unquote, Bobby wrote, quote again, to dramatically reduce our military profile in the Middle East and let the Arabs run Arabia. Other than humanitarian assistance and guaranteeing the security of Israel's borders, the U.S. has no legitimate role in this conflict. Quote, Scott says, the security of Israel's borders was a touchy subject, given the fact that Israel was in the process of expanding its borders by stealing Palestinian land through illegal settlements, occupying by Lebanese territory, the Sheba farms, and illegally annexing the Golan Heights. I had to wonder which Israeli border Bobby was so keen upon securing with American lives. Again, the Palestinian reared its head once again when Roger Waters came under fire in Germany for his live performance of The Wall in early May. When he was criticized for his performance because of the Nazi-style clothing he wore that was a feature of his act, Bobby stepped up to his defense. Roger, quote unquote, Bobby tweeted, quote, you are the global hero Orwell had in mind when he said, quote, in a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act, unquote. The high priests of the totalitarian orthodoxies are trying to silence you with censorship, gaslighting, and defamation. Please keep speaking truth to power, unquote. That was a striking endorsement by Bobby, of Roger, and was indirectly also a defense of Palestinian rights. But Bobby came under almost immediate and vigorous attack from the Jewish organizations. Roger Waters, they maintained, was anti-Semitic. The charge was not a new one. The Anti-Defamation League criticized Waters for being, quote, one of the most prominent and outspoken supporters of the BDS movement. What is the BDS movement? It's a pro-Palestinian organization that works to end international support for Israel's oppression of Palestinians and pressure Israel to comply with international law by targeting the Israeli economy and businesses which do business with Israel. According to the ADL, Roger, quote, has refused to perform in Israel and urged fellow artists to follow suit and has often used inflammatory rhetoric against the country. I don't know what they mean, by inflammatory. All the rhetoric that Roger has used is in the surface of supporting Palestinian human rights against the violations by the Israeli regimes. He hasn't done anything else. He hasn't done anything that's not in support, of international law. Scott goes into more explanation and more context. For example, some of the tenets, of Zionism and Theodore Herzl's attitudes. And he goes more into attacks by the European Jewish Conference on Roger Waters' performance from the context. Roger Waters got attacked for trivializing and belittling the Shoah and the sarcastic way in which he delights in trampling on the victims systematically murdered by the Nazis in Germany. This is what the European Jewish Conference had to say. And then here comes the United States, the U.S. Special Envoy for Monitoring and Combating Anti-Semitism, Deborah Lipstadt, posted on X, quote, I wholeheartedly concur with Schnurrbein's condemnation of Roger Waters and his despicable Holocaust distortion, unquote. Okay, the Daily Forward has an article defending orders and saying that Roger, quote, the Forward article, but noted, has defended the Concert Act, saying on social media that it is, quote, quite clearly a statement in opposition to fascism, injustice, and bigotry, okay, in all, okay, its forms. And yes, this is quite true. That's what the performance was. Uh, he was attacked by the Anne Frank Trust. He was attacked. That the community context note had a different take. Frank's name is shown as one of several victims of police or government forces as a statement against totalitarianism and oppression. Themes addressed on radio KAOS, the album from which the song is drawn. Frank is named as being killed for the crime of being Jewish. Scott says, no anti Semitism here. Anyone with a head on their shoulders saw through the nonsense of those defenders of Israel who took umbrage at Roger Waters exposing their hypocrisy. No one was buying what the pro-Zionist establishment was selling. No one, that is, except Bobby Kennedy. In my remarks about Roger Waters, I was referring to his dissent on COVID and the war in Ukraine. I've only recently learned about some of his other views, which I do not share. Kennedy then added, quote, I support Israel's right to exist within secure borders, and I also support the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people, unquote. While Bobby was admitting to as being as ignorant as the shallow politicians he was trying to differentiate himself from, says Scott, people who, when armed with superficial knowledge about a topic, embrace an issue they had nothing to do with on the assumption it might enhance their profile purpose, only to turn on a dime when confronted with controversy they did not understand and lacked the courage of their convictions to defend against. And here's a photo of a rabbi in the background. I don't know which rabbi that is, but there is Bobby Kennedy standing with his arms around Rabbi Shmuley Boteach and the rabbi's wife in June of 2023. Bobby then doubled down on his newfound stance as a, quote, staunch friend of Israel, meeting for more than 2 hours with Rabbi Shmuley Boteach to discuss, according to a posting on X put out by Boteach, quote, Israel, the rise of anti-Semitism, and Kennedy's recent tweet where he's supported by Roger Waters. And Boteach, a staunch defender of Israel and Zionism, went on to state, quote, it was courageous of Bobby to come and meet me and reassert his lifelong support of Israel and the Jewish people, continuing in the legacy of his great father, who was murdered by Palestinian gunman Sirhan because of his own support of Israel in 1968. Scott says, what's curious about this passage is Boteach's mentioning of Sirhan, the man convicted of murdering Robert F. Kennedy in 1968. Bobby is on record saying that he doesn't believe that Sirhan was the gunman who killed his father. That title, according to Bobby, belongs to Eugene Thane Caesar, a man Bobby describes as CIA operative and enemy of the Kennedy family. Quote, Caesar, was holding my father's arm, unquote, Bobby said to comedian Bill Maher in an interview. Quote, he drew his gun and my father was shot 4 times from behind, unquote. One would have to imagine this detail of his family history means something to Bobby. It is how his father died. Bobby has committed to a narrative which deviates from the public record, from Bobby's own public record. A bold move, especially if one believes in the accuracy in their position. And yet, because of Bobby's need to be seen as supporting Israel, he allowed Rabbi Boteach to reimagine this murder, to smear Palestinians with the murder of RFK and linking this murder to Israel. That Bobby allowed this to occur without correcting the record is, to be blunt, stunning. Yes, it is. It is stunning. I didn't know that Bobby actually did that specifically. But I think Scott is right to cite that. Bobby was also silent as Boteach turned his sights on Roger Waters, transforming Bobby's quote global hero unquote into something much different. Uh, okay, I'm not going to go through this, but the point is that with Bobby's association with Shmuley Boteach, he more and more tries to strengthen himself as an uncritical supporter, okay, of Israel, an unconditional supporter, okay, uh, uh, of Israel, okay, and Boteach, uh, okay, explained that Bobby's tweet about Waters was in response to someone sharing with him a picture that Waters flashed of Kennedy at one of his concerts, saluting the candidate's willingness to swim against societal currents. Bobby told me, this is a quote from the article, Bobby told me he had no idea that Waters was a vicious anti Semite, and when he studied the issue and the facts, he immediately deleted the tweet. I believe Bobby, said Shmuley, and I thank him for his repudiation of Waters. How tragic it is for Waters to have his legacy as an anti Semite now overtake his legacy as an accomplished artist, unquote. Scott says, if Bobby said these things, then he has lost all credibility as a man who is deserving to hold the office of the President of the United States. Roger Waters is not a, quote, vicious anti Semite, unquote, and for Bobby to attack him as such, assuming Rabbi Boteach has accurately recorded his words, is both intellectual and moral cowardice. And I have to agree. Things don't get better for Bobby if Rabbi Boteach manufactured this aspect of their conversation, since Bobby allowed the rabbi's words to go unchallenged. As part of the Rabbi Boteach cleansing, quote unquote, by ritual, Bobby had to agree to march with the Jewish leader in New York City's, quote, Celebrate Israel parade on June 4th. Somehow Bobby couldn't shake the Israeli anti Semitic controversy. Okay, and then Scott relates the incident at Bertoni's the Napoli restaurant on East 63rd Street, okay, in New York, where Bobby said that there is an argument that COVID-19 was ethnically targeted. COVID-19 attacks certain races disproportionately. Okay, Bobby didn't endorse this position, by the way. He just said there was an argument. But, quote, COVID-19 is targeted to attack Caucasians and black people. The people who are most immune are Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese. We don't know whether it was actually deliberately targeted or not, but there are papers out there, Bobby's talking about scientific papers here, that show the racial or ethnic differential and impact, unquote. Okay, Scott goes on uh, to sort of clarify the context, okay, of this, but okay, and also cites what Bobby had in mind and his clarification, okay, of what he said. And then he points out the controversy followed Bobby to the U.S. Congress, where he was scheduled to give high profile testimony on government censorship, but instead spent most of his time defending his comments on COVID and Jews. Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz, a Democrat from Florida, you know what a swine she is, brought up an earlier Kennedy faux pas that occurred in an anti-COVID vaccine rally in Washington, D.C. in January 2022, where he decried the COVID mandate set forth by the government. Quote, even in Hitler's Germany, Kennedy said, you could cross the Alps into Switzerland, you could hide um, 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 you could hide in an attic like Anne Frank did, unquote. Even though Kennedy apologized for his remarks, I apologize for my reference to Anne Frank, especially the families that suffered the Holocaust horrors. My intention was to use examples of past barbarism to show the perils from new technologies of control. To the extent my remarks caused hurt, I am truly and deeply sorry. Wasserman Schultz confronted Bobby, stating, you made light of the genocide against Jewish people. Kennedy was forced to apologize again. Kennedy had to again turn to Rabbi Bartea to be cleansed of the charge of anti-Semitism stemming from his July 11th comments. Rabbi Bartea conducted a 35-minute interview with Kennedy, and I think a lot of us saw that interview. Afterwards, the popular rabbi declared, quote, Bobby Kennedy and I are friends, and I like him. Kennedy, unquote, Boteach said, and quote again, is the only major Democrat who has come out against the Iran deal. Bobby Kennedy is one of the only Democrats who spoke out boldly to protect Israel with its recent Jenin assault on terrorists. He defended Israel. So that was another act of contrition, says Scott, Kennedy had to subject himself to before he could shed the anti-Semitism charge. And interview with the strongly pro-Israel Jewish News Syndicate. Here, Bobby, for the first time in such detail, set forth the depth of his support for Israel, especially its importance, quote, as the only Middle East democracy, unquote, and, quote, the significance of its military alliance, okay, with the United States. Now, Israel is only a democracy if you consider that the Ashkenazi Jews, okay, in Israel have more rights, okay, than any other Jews. There are laws that constrain the rights of the new, okay, darker immigrants. There are laws that constrain the rights of the Mizrahi Jews. But most of all, there's a hierarchy there. Okay, there's a pyramid with the Arab citizens of Israel on the bottom in terms of the rights that they have. So, in that sense, it isn't true to say that Israel, okay, is a democracy. But on the other hand, it's not true to say the United States is a democracy either, for various reasons we've discussed on many occasions here. Bobby declared he was aware of no other country that has Israel's military discipline, which he calls its, quote, unique moral approach to warfare. According to the JNS interview, the Jewish News Syndicate interview, Bobby noted that, quote, Israel tries to treat Palestinians with justice and morally and has sought a two-state solution despite the abject refusal of the Palestinian leadership to negotiate and genocidal aspirations of the Palestinian Authority. Well, this statement is just so outrageous on so many levels. In other words, okay, I'll briefly say, are the Israelis treating the Palestinians in any kind of moral way now? Are there attacks mostly on civilians in the Gaza Strip? Are those moral? Is the collective punishment they're meting out to the Palestinians moral? Is their killing of more than 10,000 people up to this point through the bombings moral, and more than 3,000 children and 2,300 women? Are these moral acts? Is there treating of the Palestinians in the West Bank, where they fully support the constant attacks by the settlers on the Palestinians there? Are those moral acts, by Israel? I mean, didn't Bobby know what the hell was going on? Now, when he made that statement, of course, it was before the current war. But the way the Israelis had been treating the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip for decades was there for him to see. And the current actions when he spoke concerning the treatment of the Palestinians in the West Bank, that was there for him to see as well. We do not see, it is Israeli propaganda that casualties of the IDF forces show a deliberate, purposeful attempt in order to protect civilians. That is not true, and that cannot be sustained. But he has insisted on pursuing the moral argument for Israel and using his campaign as a bully pulpit, to do so. He defended Israel's military conduct against the Palestinians, criticizing the gray zones that Max Blumenthal in the process. And he said, I love Max Blumenthal, unquote. He said to Jimmy Dore in an interview, but quote, unquote again, I do not think he's objective on Israel. Look who's talking. His reporting on Israel needs to be questioned, unquote. When Dore challenged Bobby to do an interview with Max, Bobby agreed, only to have his staff reverse course, saying such an interview would not happen. Scott says, Bobby's position was a disaster. I can personally attest to several high-profile political personalities who were ready to throw in with Bobby, only to have his position on Israel cause them to take stock of where they stood. Like me, they were attracted by Bobby's anti-war stance and his embrace of diplomacy as the ideal tool to resolve Bobby's anti-war stance. And his embrace of diplomacy is the ideal tool to resolve the relations of the U.S. to Russia. But Bobby's unquestioning embrace of the militarism of Israel put him in a new light, something that did not bode well for the anti-war candidate, especially when looking at his hardline positions vis-a-vis Iran and China. Bobby was losing votes at a time when he could ill afford to do so. Scott says, I stood by Bobby during this hard time, convinced that the wisdom and insight he exhibited in his piece of diplomacy speech was the real Bobby, and that warmonger Bobby could be managed once he secured the nomination. Oh, you should never make an assumption that a politician can be managed. But he was still a Democrat, and as such, I feared he would never survive in a system where the people had been supplanted by superdelegates who would throw the election to the incumbent Joe Biden, regardless of how the people voted. I had trouble vesting myself too much in someone I didn't think was going to clear the starting gate. Fortunately, Bobby and his team had reached a similar conclusion. He accused the DNC of strategically shifting the Iowa primary and implementing rules that penalize candidates who campaign in certain states. Well, that wasn't simply, an accusation. That was a fact. I mean, the DNC did that. Moreover, it's a matter of record. So it's more than just an accusation. Moreover, Bobby believed the DNC's control over superdelegates and automatic delegates make it virtually impossible for any candidate other than Bobby to secure the nomination. Bobby would need to win almost 80% of all states to outmaneuver Biden, assuming Biden only wins 20% of the vote. Quote, it's pretty clear that the DNC doesn't want a primary, unquote, Bobby said. Quote, they're effectively disenfranchising Democratic voters from having any choice in who becomes president or who becomes the nominee of the Democratic Party. I think Bobby was at least 2 months late in coming to that kind of realization. Bobby then made the only choice possible, says Scott, if he was going to be a viable candidate for president. He declared himself as an independent. This should have been a huge event. The very act would separate him from both Democrats and Republicans, thereby liberating him to become a third center of gravity, which, through the strength of his personality and integrity, could start to steal voters from the orbits of the two major parties. The announcement was scheduled for October 9th in Philadelphia. On October 7th, Hamas launched its attack on Israel. Quote, this ignominious, unprovoked, and barbaric attack on Israel must be met with world condemnation and unequivocal support for the Jewish state's right to self-defense, unquote. Bobby posted on that same day, quote, we must provide Israel with whatever it needs to defend itself now. As president, I'll make sure that our policy is unambiguous so that the enemies of Israel will think long and hard before attempting aggression of any kind. I applaud the strong statements of support from the Biden White House for Israel in her hour of need. However, the scale of these attacks means it is likely that Israel will need to wage a sustained military campaign to protect its citizens. Statements of support are fine, but we must follow through with unwavering, resolute, practical action. America must stand by our ally throughout this operation and beyond as it exercises its sovereign right to self-defense. There's a picture of Bobby when he announced his candidacy as an independent. The anti-war candidate whose stance regarding peace and diplomacy this is Scott again, was the telling difference between his Democratic and Republican competitors. I had just defined himself as a pro-war leader. I pointed this out in a response to Bobby's post, quote, I like RFK Jr., unquote. I wrote, quote again, I think he's the best choice for POTUS. He's positioned himself as the peace candidate. And this is the tweet I fear may have sunk his chances. Israel's policies regarding Palestine are indefensible. Bobby should be promoting an equitable peace settlement, not war, unquote. Bobby had one last chance to salvage his candidacy, his high-profile announcement on October 9th. He blew it. Rabbi Shmuley Boteach introduced Bobby by calling for a moment of silence for the Israeli victims. Then Bobby proceeded to say nothing about the single most pressing issue of the day. This was his chance to weigh in on the side of peace, to promote the very peace and diplomacy message he articulated back in June. He was silent, instead letting Rabbi Boteach speak on his behalf after the announcement, and speak he did. Dismissing criticisms from Jewish groups that Bobby had not addressed the Hamas-Israeli conflict, Boteach said that Boteach's involvement in the October 9th event defined Kennedy's stance toward Israel. Quote, I think that was very brave of him and showed tremendous solidarity that he asked a rabbi who was his close friend. who's his close friend. You know he moved away from the political figures who could have introduced him and endorsed him. The fact that I'm the one who introduced him, I think, said it all, unquote. 5 days later, on October 14th, Bobby removed Dennis Kucinich as his campaign manager, replacing the veteran politician with a political neophyte, Amaryllis Fox Kennedy, Bobby's daughter-in-law, and a former CIA clandestine officer known more popularly as a former spook. That last was added by me in commentary. I count Dennis as a friend. We've known each other for decades, ever since he invited me to testify in Congress about President George W. Bush's flawed claims of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. I supported Dennis in his own bid for the presidency back in 2000. I believe that Dennis also ran, if I'm not mistaken, in 2008. And half of the past several years, that was me, and half of the past several years had the honor of serving with him on a prestigious advisory board where we provide our opinions on matters pertaining to geopolitics. Dennis' hand could be felt in Bobby's powerful peace and diplomacy speech. Sadly, the same could not be said of Bobby's stance on Israel. Dennis had spent his political life defending the rights of Palestinians in the face of Israeli oppression, while both Dennis and the Kennedy campaign have been silent as to the reasons behind the precipitous firing or the precipitous leaving of Dennis, whichever it was. Smart money says that the Israeli issue played a major factor in the decision. Quote, not a good look, unquote, I posted on X, quote, at a time when America should be excited about Kennedy's independent run, his indefensible support of Israel is sinking his campaign. He is not only failing to gain any traction, but also bleeding support from a critical base of potential supporters, those Americans who bought into his rhetoric of peace, unquote. And I might add here, bleeding support from those Americans who cannot tolerate either the Bush or the Biden candidacy for president. By aligning himself so closely with the Israelis and their oppression of the Palestinians, what Bobby has done is basically associate himself, at least in the area of policies towards Israel, with both Trump and also Biden. So the very basis of his supposedly different candidacy has been undermined by the extremity of his position on Israel. Bobby's commitment to peace and diplomacy, it was made him viable as a presidential candidate, whereas two likely opponents were on record supporting Israel without question. Bobby could have followed in his uncle's path, advocating that all Americans, this is Scott, by the way, walk in the shoes of the Palestinian people to better understand their grievances, and in doing so be better positioned to come up with a fair and equitable peace based on diplomacy, not war. Bobby did not and has not. His appointment of Amaryllis Fox Kennedy bodes poorly for the future. I will continue to applaud Bobby for his stance on Russia and disarmament, but until he fundamentally changes course on Israel, I can't, in good faith, claim to support his candidacy. If his name gets on the ballot, I may end up voting for him as the lesser evil. But that is not high praise. The United States deserves better. The world deserves better. The people of Palestine deserve better. And that is God's peace. I spent a lot of time on it in preparing for the issue that I want to raise here. That issue is, why did Bobby take such a position? Why did he wrap himself in Rabbi Shmuley Boteach? Why did he feel that he had to do that? Why did he back off from Roger Waters even? Why has he done all the things that he has done to wrap his arms around basically Benjamin Netanyahu? Because that's what he's doing. When he associates himself so closely with Rabbi Shmuley, he's associating himself closely with the settlers in Israel, with the Ben-Guriers, with the Smotriches, and with also Netanyahu and his government. In doing so, he's opposing most of world opinion, but I'm telling you the operative factor now in why he would do this. We have said previously tonight that most probably the billionaires are going to spend $10 billion on the 2024 campaign. That means that the Democratic candidate for the presidency running in that campaign and running inside of the primary is probably going to have to raise a total of maybe $2.5 billion all by himself in this campaign. That's probably Bobby's calculation. And he's wondering where this $2.5 billion is coming from. He's being supported now by certain billionaires. He's being supported also by lots of individuals. The full finances on his campaign haven't come out yet, at Open Secrets, but I guarantee that it will tell that most of his support comes from donations larger than $200, and that there's also considerable super PAC support for him. But the big financial prize for Bobby Kennedy, if he can get to it, is the same money that is supporting Rabbi Boteach. It is the Adelson fortune, now controlled by Sheldon Adelson's widow. His widow controls that whole fortune, which is something like $55 billion. That's the prize that Bobby wants in back of him for this campaign. So, that is yet another example of the influence of the oligarchs on our politics. If you wonder why Bobby was caving without qualification, caving extremely, wrapping his arms around Rabbi Shmuley, who in turn wraps his arms around the Netanyahu regime, and who wraps his arms about the settlers. A lot of the money for the settlers, comes from the Adelson fortune, and has come from that fortune. So here it is, the power, extreme power of an oligarch and their fortune, turning a presidential candidate who is trying to be a peace candidate and who was risking his career to be a peace candidate in relation to Ukraine. that person is now turned into a warmonger by the structure of the system, by the oligarchy, by their collective financial power, and his need to have an oligarch with huge amounts of money back him. Now, Bobby is a rich man himself. He's said to be worth $60 million. But that pales before the 55 billion or so in the Adelson fortune. He needs that kind of oligarchical support because Trump is going to get that kind of oligarchical support. Biden is probably going to get that kind of oligarchical support. So Bobby probably figured that he needed it too. And that is going to get me close to the end of my presentation tonight. Of course, the major point that I have is the only way to fight back against the influence of the oligarchs and to stop their control of our political system and to make our candidates honest women and men working for the people and looking only to the people for support is to vote against the people who are getting money from the rich. It's to follow the rule. And we don't have this campaign really started up yet. And I am not a good one to run such a campaign. I may be able to speak well about it. I may be able to speak in a compelling way about it. But I am not a good and strong organizer. I need organizers to put together this campaign. And I am not one. But this campaign is needed. And it's needed by election 2024. And the Bobby Kennedy situation is a perfect illustration of the need for this campaign. We desperately needed, a presidential candidate who was not beholden, to oligarchy. And Bobby was the most promising such person. And by the way, there's some evidence that Marianne Williamson is getting money from rich people. And of course, we know the story came, it was a minor incident, of course, just a couple of weeks ago. But Cornel West got a $3,300 contribution from Harlan Crow that he was taking, that he didn't see anything wrong with taking. Harlan Crow, the billionaire who's bought the Supreme Court. We have to make it toxic for any candidate who takes the big money. And if we could get the Dump the Corruption campaign into high gear and get voters accepting that they must vote according to the rule, that is the only way to get our democracy back. That is the only way to get our representatives actually representing the people. If we could get people voting on that basis, that would be a counter to the big money. Why would it be a counter? Because if people hear about this rule and they realize they must vote according to this rule to have their democracy back and to have their representatives actually represent them and not their donors, they would vote against all of the candidates taking big money. They would vote against Joe Biden. They would vote against Donald Trump. They would vote against Bobby Kennedy. And if he continues to do so, they would vote against Cornel West, okay, and Marianne Williamson. And they would vote against anyone who is taking the big money. And that includes people in Congress, people at the state legislature level, and people in local government. They would exclude these people, disqualify them immediately, because they were taking the big money, and they will immediately say to themselves, I'm voting for someone else. Why? Because I want someone who's going to represent me. I don't want someone who's going to represent the donors. That's the key point. If you want someone to represent you, you have to vote for someone who's not taking the big money. Because anyone who takes millions and millions from the oligarchs, or even thousands and thousands from relatively rich people, that's not someone who's going to represent you. That's someone who's going to represent the interests of the rich people. The rich people do not want or care about federal job guarantees. They do not care about having Medicare for all, because they're okay, Jack. They have great health care. They pay for it. They get it. They do not want laws passed that will manage the climate emergency at the expense of their profits. They do not want foreign policies that will minimize us getting involved in the wars, that will bring our military bases home, that will collaborate with other nations for the benefit of all. Why not? Because that will cut into their profits. If they invest, okay, in lithium companies, for example, and we fail to force other countries to give those companies their lithium at very low prices, then that's going to cut into their profits. But if they invest, okay, in companies that need certain raw materials from around the world, they won't want to support the kind of collaborative foreign policy that, in the interests of world peace, we must now pursue. They will want to continue to follow the imperialist and hegemonist foreign policies that the United States has been following over a long period of time. There's a connection between the donors and our policies. There's a connection between the donors and oligarchy. They are the essence of the oligarchy. They are the essence of undermining our democracy. They are preventing a whole range of policies that would be good for us, but not particularly good for them. They are against 90 or 95% tax rates, while we should be for those, because they need their money taken away, because they're using their money to undermine our democracy. That is why they can't be billionaires. That is why we should not only have high income tax rates, but very high inheritance rates and high wealth taxes, so they don't have the money to buy the political system. But pending all those things, what we immediately need is people voting according to this rule. And I'm going to display it once again before I take your comments. because it is very, very important. It is very, very important. So here it is once more. Vote against every candidate except those who won't take money from wealthy corporations, individuals, PACs, or party committees, and who repudiate all super PAC support. Okay, in other words, don't take anything but small donations. That's all you can take. And vote against everybody who is taking other than small donations. We, the voters, can force the politicians into that kind of pattern and undermine the power of the oligarchs, as a result. And that is what we have to do. I'm going to cover your comments now very briefly. It's 11:08. I've been here for 2 hours and 8 minutes. I didn't mean to be here for that long, but I kind of got into it. I hope you liked it. Sunny Day, do you think Bobby Jr. would be a good president? The answer is, I think Bobby Jr. would be a great president if he were not bought by the oligarchs. But he's setting himself to be murdered by the oligarchs. Sandy says, I read an article about how his dad was murdered by someone else. Yeah, and he believes that too. Kay says, yet, but he is not like his dad at all. No, in many ways he is like his dad, I believe. Like said, I don't know much about him. I haven't been checking out people running. I've been busy with other stuff. I need to get more information on who is running and their backgrounds. Well, if you want to get more information on Robert Kennedy and his positions, don't just go to the mass media, because they are full of crap. Bobby is not a vax denier. Mostly GOP, it's not true mostly GOP are liking him. A lot of GOP are liking him. Maybe a majority of supporters are from the GOP. But many, many Democrats are also liking him. And if the Democrats weren't smearing him as a vax denier, many, many more Democrats would like him. I keep close watch on the research on the vaccines. Do you know Kay? I say Kay is not really here anymore, but she might watch this again. Does Kay know that recent research is showing that the more of the mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, that you take, the greater your chances are of getting COVID, that your chances of getting COVID increase with each booster you take? Does Kay know that? I wonder. That is relevant. Does Kay know that there are ways to protect yourself from COVID? But through diet, you can strengthen the immune system so that you are less likely to get COVID, and even if you get it, it will be much less likely to devastate you. Does Kay know about research in other countries regarding the relative effectiveness, of some of the remedies we cannot mention on YouTube, but that have worked well in other countries? Does Kay know why the death rates in Africa due to COVID was so much less than the death rates here in the United States? I think Bobby's position on vaccines is actually quite rational. He wants testing. He wants more science. He wants more data on the vaccines. And above all, he wants more responsibility on the part of the government in its recommendations concerning the vaccines. By the way, does Kay know that the vaccines that were originally tested by Pfizer, okay, and Moderna were not the vaccines that were shipped and actually given to people? Does Kay know about that? Kay says, okay, guys, I'm out of here for tonight. I love you all. I love you too, Kay. Sandy says, Bobby is another sellout. Good night, Kay. Kay says, night, honey. Sandy says, good show. Sandy says, our doctor told us not to get any more shots. Yes, Kay, because your doctor knew the research that getting more shots at this point would be more likely to expose you to COVID. Also, the current variants, the B287 variant that's currently spreading around, the B2, the vaccines that have just come out do not provide any protection against the B287 variant as far as we know. They were not aimed at that particular variant. But we do know the more boosters you get, the more likely you are to get COVID. So your doctor took the perfectly rational position, don't get any more shots. It might be dangerous. Yeah. Your doctor's a good doctor, Sandy. Bobby's problem is not that he's anti-vax. His problem is that he is disingenuously totally committed to Israel in the current situation, okay, and the other conflict. Ah, yes, she is. I'm sorry. Did I say he? I should have realized that it could certainly well be a she. After all, my own doctor is a she. But anyway, to get back to the point, it is Bobby's position on Israel, okay, that is a problem. And the likelihood that this position is influenced by his desire to get at some of that big Adelson pot of money that is sitting there and that Rabbi Shmuley Boteach is close to, because that's the money that's supporting his endeavors around the world on behalf, okay, of Israel. So that's what is going on. And that money was so important to Bobby that he replaced Dennis Kucinich as his campaign manager, because, of course, Dennis wasn't going to sit still for the kind of position that Bobby took, okay, on Israel. So I think that covers your comments. I'm so glad you came back, Sandy. I hope to see you frequently in the coming months. I've really missed you in these streams. I know you've had serious family business to take care of, okay, and worry about. Okay, so anyway, but that is what it is. But I still missed you very much. And so thank you for coming tonight. So here we go. It's time to say goodnight. Tomorrow I will have, okay, a neoliberalism show On Friday, I'll be interviewing Christina Khalil, who is running for the Senate, in New Jersey for the Green Party. And we'll be talking about Dump the Corruption, I think, a good bit in that particular show. I think Madeline Hoffman is going to be with me for that show and with Christine for that show. I'm sorry, Christina. Christina is, I think, a very, very good, an honest candidate, but you'll see for yourself, on Friday. Also, Madeline is working for her campaign, and also Shane Coughlin is working for her campaign as well. So they both are working for her campaign. And of course, I am listening carefully and seriously to what they have to say about it. But I also want to tell Christina about the Dump the Corruption campaign and how important it can be if candidates actually run a Dump the Corruption campaign as an equalizer to get them a chance against more very well-funded candidates. I'll tell you about Jersey, what I think is going to happen. I think in the Democratic primary that Andy Kim is going to slaughter Menendez in the Democratic primary campaign. But Andy Kim is a big money Democrat from the Obama administration. He worked for the Obama administration. He's run as a clean gene for Congress, and he's acted as if he's a clean gene, trying to give that kind of impression to the public. But if you look at his open secrets record, most of the money he takes is from well-off individuals. He says he doesn't take any corporate PAC money. But folks, I'm telling you, that's not enough. You can't take big money of any kind. You can't take money from the corporations themselves directly. You can't take any money from wealthy individuals. You can't allow super PAC money to go while remaining silent about that super PAC money. You have to repudiate it. You can't take any money from party committees, though, because that is laundered money from the billionaires, from the PACs, and from other well-off sources. You have to go only with small dollar donations. Andy Kim will not do that. He has already raised big money for his campaigns. The average money raised by Congresspeople in the 2022 election was something like $3.4 million. But Andy Kim raised over $5 million for his campaign. That means he took big money. He will take the big money again if Christina Khalil is going to run against him and have any hope of winning. She has to have an equalizer. The equalizer is the Dump the Corruption campaign. She has to run a Dump the Corruption campaign and strengthen our Dump the Corruption campaign in doing so, our more generalized Dump the Corruption campaign. And not just she. We need all the Green Party candidates for Congress and for the Senate in New Jersey to run Dump the Corruption campaigns. We need them to do it, not for ourselves, but for them. They need to do it or they will never win. So on that note, I'm finally going to say goodnight. I'm sorry I got so involved here tonight. but I really care about this. It's really, really important. We won't be supporting Israel to the extent we are now, except for the oligarchs and except for their donor money. That's why we're supporting them. If you think that we're backing Israel too much and that we should be in favor of a ceasefire and also negotiations for an end to the Israel-Palestine crises, then you've got to be against the donor money, you've got to be against the oligarchs, and you've got to be for the Dump the Corruption campaign. So thanks for being here, and I'll see you tomorrow for a neoliberalism show, and on Friday for another Dump the Corruption show. Thank you, folks, for coming. And thank you again, Sandy.